Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here and back in Colorado. I want to thank Jim for his kind introduction and even kinder invitation for me to come out here, and to Jay Precourt and all of you for just an outstanding program that you've put together, and my appreciation for the privilege of being part of it. I will plan today to talk about four things. First, to give an overview of the global natural gas market and how these issues of natural gas exports from the United States have arisen, and some of the reasons for the immense commercial interest in exporting natural gas from the United States, and then move into the public policy issues that have arisen about LNG exports, which are driven by the fact that the Natural Gas Act requires that the Department of Energy grant approval for any export of natural gas from the United States. So I'll spend a bit of time talking about that approval process. A central part of the approval process for the Department of Energy was the criterion of whether or not natural gas exports are in the public interest, which is central to DOE's decision about granting approvals. Back in 2011, the Department of Energy had received a number of applications for approval of LNG export projects, and it decided to pause in considering them to look more thoroughly into the public interest issue. And at that point, the Department of Energy asked my team at NERA to do an independent analysis of the economic impacts of LNG exports, which we did. And I will therefore devote most of my talk to discussing the issues that were addressed, the issues that have arisen about natural gas exports, the findings of our study that we did for DOE, the issues that have arisen since that study, and then to talk about a new study which will be released publicly, I think, next week, trying to wrap up some of those kind of remaining controversies. I wanted to start with an overview of the natural gas market. Rob Gardner really, I think, covered everything that is necessary to know at this point about how the global natural gas market is likely to develop, so I'll try to do this very briefly to save a little bit more time for questions at the end. It's hard to believe that as recently as 2010, the United States was an importer of liquefied natural gas. That's how rapidly things have changed. As Rob pointed out, looking into the future, we expect global demand for natural gas to increase quite rapidly. Our study, because of the request of the Department of Energy, has started out with the reference cases produced by the Energy Information in its international and annual energy outlooks. And EIA sees by 2040 about the same increase of 60% in global natural gas demand, with about a third of it coming from Asian countries, but substantial increases in the United States and Europe as well. The question is, how much of that global increase in natural gas demand is the United States likely to be able to provide? And this is precisely what has provided some of the excitement, many interests both in and outside the United States in exports of natural gas from the US. And as you have heard repeatedly today, the source of those exports is going to be the tremendous explosion of natural gas from tight gas production. And this is EIA's projection of how both shale gas production and total natural gas production in the United States will climb over the next few decades. So what that leads to is an expectation that global trade in natural gas will continue to expand. Not all of those countries whose demand for natural gas is increasing are going to be able to supply it from their own resources. The red are the regions where we project that there will be more natural gas demand than can be supplied through their domestic production. Japan, a great deal of it in China, in Korea, some actually in the Southeast Asian countries, and a great deal in Europe. The supplies are going to be coming from Russia, some from the Middle East, some from Australia, and a pretty substantial part of those supplies could come from the United States. Again, this is looking out to 2040. So that's the background. Why the great interest in exporting LNG from the United States? It's to make money. And the gleam in the eye of just about every potential exporter is coming from the very high prices that Japan and Korea have been paying for liquefied natural gas deliveries up until now. In Japan and Korea, and also in the EU, the price of natural gas is linked to the price of oil in long-term contracts. And I'm now going to pick up my laser pointer and do a little bit and move around a little bit. And as usual with laser pointers, it doesn't work. The US market provides a unique opportunity for the buyers because of the fact that natural gas is so cheap in the United States, and that you can actually, if you're a Korean buyer or a Japanese buyer, or European buyer, come in, buy natural gas at Henry Hub, then you just have to figure out what to do with it. Thinking about that, let's take a look at the chart here. The $16 or so price is the oil-linked price that's been pretty prevalent in Japan. The bars build up the cost of producing gas, liquefying gas, shipping it to Japan, regasifying it, and delivering it for use. And we can see there are a lot of regions that could profitably ship gas to Japan. The excitement in the United States is coming from that double-headed arrow on the right-hand side, which suggests that there's about $4 profit to be made after you incur all of these costs if you can get the gas to Japan and sell it at current oil-linked prices. But although the US is better positioned than some shippers, it has many competitors in this market who can actually get more gas to Japan more cheaply than the US could. And those are the rivals that we have to worry about as we think about the global market for natural gas. There's Canada. The government of British Columbia would love to export LNG from their terminals. There's Russian gas that could be moved by pipeline to Europe, or is LNG from Siberia. Other Pacific countries, Australia has been a rival, though they have a little bit of a hard time finishing an LNG liquefaction facility at a cost that is going to be tolerable. But the big player in global markets for a long time has been Qatar, which had substantially more capacity to produce gas than it's actually exporting. But it's that differential that is producing the gleam in the eye. But I want to draw your attention to one other thing in this chart, which is the green at the bottom of the US bar is the market price of gas in the US, which in this particular scenario in 2028, we're projecting to be about a little over $5 a million BTU. Everything between that and the $12 delivered cost to Japan is transportation cost. So no matter what happens with the growth of LNG exports, the US is going to retain a 2-to-1 advantage in natural gas costs over anybody who is importing gas from the US, because what it's going to cost to get the gas to Japan is just about equal to what the price is in the United States, which means thinking about competition between any US industry that is using natural gas and their rivals in the Far East or Europe, their rivals, as long as they're importers, are going to have to pay twice as much for gas as our industries do. And that's good news for US industry. And I think that's behind a lot of what Tom Petrie was talking about. Exports to most countries must be approved by the Department of Energy. Under the Natural Gas Act, there are two categories of countries. If a country has a free trade agreement with the United States, then DOE must approve their application without delay. But that's a very small volume that could actually flow to those countries. Canada is a natural gas producer itself. Mexico may well be taking some gas from the United States, but it's going to be limited. Most of the other free trade countries are in the Caribbean. They're pretty small. The non-free trade area countries are where the big bucks are for exporting natural gas. DOE, as I said, must, actually it's a negative finding. DOE can only disapprove an application if it finds that exports would not be in the public interest. I'll let you parse out all of the negatives in that. But the factors that are included in public interest include economic factors, energy security, and environmental impacts. So to help with this public interest determination, as I said, DOE commissioned us to do a study of the economic impacts of LNG exports. So let me turn to that now. DOE wanted an independent study. This is the first project I have ever done for the United States government since I became a consultant 20 years ago. And it was the staff in DOE Fossil Energy were just tremendous to work with because they really did ask us to do an independent study, let us do an independent study, and then considered our findings. But they asked us to look at a range of potential exports in order to get an idea of what difference does it make if DOE were to limit exports at various levels, or what would happen if DOE simply approved every application that came through and let the market sort it out. They asked us to rely on the U.S. Energy Information Administration for our characterization of the resource supply, of the supply curves in the United States, and generally of the outlook for U.S. natural gas markets. And that's what we have normally done in calibrating our models. So that was fine. And to incorporate key uncertainties about global markets. And what we really had to do, which was different for this study, was we had to figure out how much natural gas the rest of the world would be willing to take from the US at various different prices. Because all we could really do, well, all the Energy Information Administration could do was to figure out, for any given quantity of natural gas exports, what would be the market clearing price at which the US produced enough gas in order to satisfy domestic demand plus that specified level of exports. But it said nothing about whether the world market would be willing to take 12 TCF of gas at $12 a million BTU, or if there would be excess demand for gas at $3 a million BTU. That was our job, first to assess the international market, and then to look at macroeconomic impacts in the United States. And we developed 63 different scenarios for gas exports to look at all of the relevant uncertainties and policy options. So we looked at two types of uncertainty. One was geology. Technically, we looked at different projections that that EIA had made based on assumptions about the size and quality of the US gas resource. And at one end, it was kind of the shale revolution peters out, and the other that things keep getting better and better. And we had that wider range. I would say that a better interpretation of at least the low supply case was not that the shale revolution peters out, but that it's killed. That regulation, fracking bans, an unfortunate occurrence that leads to the kind of media bubble that Alan was talking about in the first presentation this morning shuts it off, or that opponents from, and that would be the major concern. I think that's also something that is represented in the low resource cases that we look about. On the demand side, we looked at uncertainties about global supply and demand, all of which were uncertainties basically on the high side. That is, what if all of Asia shuts down its nuclear industry? What if other exporters don't expand at the pace that we're expecting them to? Suppose we get really, really high levels of demand globally for US exports. Is that going to overstress the system? Is there some sort of a sweet spot where we ought to stop exporting? And then we looked at policy choices on the whole range from no LNG exports at all to let the market sort it out. In the 2012 study, I'm not going to go over these findings in detail because I will cover the same ground in talking about our more recent findings. But what we found was that across all the scenarios that we looked at, the US had net economic benefits from allowing LNG exports. And that the higher the level of exports that was allowed, the greater those economic benefits were. And we also found that the market was self-correcting, in that if it cost a lot to produce natural gas in the United States, and the Henry Hub price was high, we weren't going to have very many buyers and LNG exports would be low. And the only cases in which we would have high level of exports would be if it's so relatively inexpensive to produce natural gas in the United States that there's plenty for all the domestic users that want it, as well as the importers. And I'll talk about, as well as the importers, yes. And I'll talk about that in a little more detail. And as Tom mentioned, we found absolutely no possibility that the US price, that the price in the US could become linked to oil prices in the way it is in other countries, or even that it could come close to what it would be in oil importing countries. So what about the DOE approval process now? I just digress for a minute to give a little background on that. The first application that DOE approved after it after it had reviewed all of this information and started granting approvals again was from Freeport. Freeport was mainly going to supply Japanese customers, and it was essentially a utility type plan. The customers would buy capacity at the liquefaction plant. They would sign a long-term take-or-pay contract to pay for that capacity no matter what. They would buy gas at Henry Hub, and the Japanese and other importers would take all of the risk. In the process of issuing that opinion, DOE said nice things about much of our work. They accepted all of our findings about the nature of net benefits, of the lack of harm to manufacturing, of the likely effects on natural gas prices. And they affirmed a number of policy positions that had been kind of stated before by the administration and DOE about allowing the market to choose the direction in which natural gas would go, about a preference for free trade as U.S. policy, and in particular that net benefits mattered, that DOE was not going to try to referee and determine which of the many parties who wanted to extract some rents from the LNG export process was more meritorious. They were just going to look at net benefits. Good for DOE. But they didn't state any general policy about what they were going to do and left the door open that they might actually come back and reassess some of this and change their minds. Currently, there's about 8.5 billion cubic feet per day of capacity approved for exports to non-free trade area countries. There's a huge amount approved to free trade area countries, and just about all of those applicants who filed for permission to ship to non-free trade area also obtain licenses to ship to free trade area. So there's some overlap here. But the list on the right shows you what the applications were. Almost all of these are on the Gulf Coast, predominantly in Louisiana, predominantly at locations where we were importing LNG 10 years ago because they have the infrastructure to rapidly turn around. They just have to build the liquefaction facility and they're good to go. Cove Point is the one exception. It's in Maryland. It's facing a lot of local opposition, and there are several applications to export from Oregon, which also are facing local opposition. The issues that have come up in this and that we've tried to address, I put in three categories. What the exporters are worried about now is the order of consideration. DOE is going through a list of applications based on when they were filed, a little more complicated than that, but that's about it. But some of the filings that are at the top of the list are for projects that are nowhere near ready, and some of the applications that they won't even consider for a year or two are spade-ready projects that have their financing and their customers and are well on the way to approval at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So there's worry about some of these projects further down the line of whether the window will be closing for them and rivals outside the US will grab the markets before they do. The opponents raise questions about competitiveness, which Tom has already introduced, about the effect on energy prices and about the cumulative impacts of higher and higher level of DOE approving more and more applications. And there are a couple of broader issues. One of them has to do with trade and diplomacy, whether the US should use LNG exports as a way of extracting concessions from countries like India or China or other trading partners, or whether it would embarrass us to file suits at the World Trade Organization against China for restricting exports of critical materials when at the same time we're undertaking exactly the same kind of restrictions on natural gas exports. So there's some broad questions here. But there's also an awful lot of simply self-interested efforts to, as I said, gain a share of the rents that are associated with producing natural gas and exporting it. And a great many, if you like, extraneous issues that are being loaded onto the LNG export process. So one part of this is the debate about whether natural gas producers should be allowed to export natural gas, or whether they should be prevented from exporting natural gas so that the next user of natural gas down the chain can get it cheaper and export its products and make more money. So that's a lot of the controversy that's going on. But there are also environmental objections objections by the environmental community to LNG exports that really have nothing to do with LNG exports, but are tied to a wish to reduce natural gas production. And I would say those are the wrong form, and that is probably, we'll talk about this a little later. But I think the problem is that you're not going to stop natural gas production by preventing exports. And if natural gas production is regulated efficiently and effectively, as we've been talking about earlier today, it will slightly shift the supply curve for US exports, but the problem will be dealt with and exports will become irrelevant to the environmental management of natural gas. So, quick review of our study. The two objections that came up to our study issued in 2012 were really, first was that we'd relied on out-of-date information because we based our study on work done by the Energy Information Administration in 2011. And the claims were that we were ignoring how the manufacturing renaissance was being driven by low natural gas prices, and that we were failing to account for growing domestic needs for natural gas. And the second set of objections really were associated with requests that DOE stop issuing export approvals and look again at the cumulative impacts of the exports that they had already authorized. And those are the two things that we really wanted to address in this new study, which, as I said, will be released publicly within the next week. I'm grateful to Cheniere Energy, which sponsored this analysis, which was an equally independent analysis done precisely along the lines of what we did for the Department of Energy. Looked at the same 63 scenarios, but we brought in updated information from EIA about natural gas demand, the growth in natural gas demand, about supply conditions in the United States. So essentially, we were looking at conditions which made it possible to have higher levels of exports from the United States and simultaneously lower natural gas prices within the United States than we saw in our previous study. We wanted to look at the three issues of cumulative impact and demand, of impacts on the manufacturing sector, and then we decided we would take a look at effective LNG exports on unemployment as well. This is the most important slide I want to show you, and I will try once more to see, it works. Okay, we have three groups of slides here. Three groups of results here. Up here is what I would call, this is the low oil and gas resource supply case. This is the case if it's really costly to produce natural gas in the United States, either because of technology or regulation or public opposition. Down here at the bottom is the high resource, well, you get the idea. The curve at the bottom is the high resource supply curve. It's the one that we'll get if the Shell resolution just gets better and the better. And the middle is EIA's central reference case. Now, we start out with assuming there's no LNG exports allowed at all. So we see that in 2028, EIA's reference case prediction is about $4.50 for a price of gas. In the low oil and gas resource case, it's about $2.30. And in the high oil and gas resource case, it's about $6. Well, now let's look at the range of effects. If we are in the reference case, then the maximum amount of exports that the world might take under an unlimited export scenario, where DOE just approves everything, could produce a price increase of a little bit less than $1, but it would still be around $5 a million BTU, even in 2028. If we have a really low-cost production of natural gas, we might get up to exporting as much as 13 TCF of LNG. That would be about half of our current production. But the price would still remain $3.50 or less than it is today. And in the high resource case, we find the exports are really chopped off very rapidly, and the price of natural gas is already quite high. So we're looking at maybe a 75-cent increase above a price that would already be $6, but very much less being exported. Now, we might return to a question about how these exports might affect the global market, because in developing these projections, we assumed that the rest of the exporters, in particular Qatar, would restrict their output enough to maintain oil-linked pricing in Asia, what all of the exports would love to see. But if the US is exporting 10, 12 TCF of natural gas, the world market is going to change. And our belief is that at reasonably high levels of US exports, other exporters would decide it's in their interest to compete with gas-on-gas competition in pricing. That would mean the US would be netting back lower prices, and we probably wouldn't see such high level of exports, and we also wouldn't see such high domestic prices. This is a big issue for investors in LNG projects because they are highly capital intensive, and you really care whether the global market is going to support a price of about $3 or a price of about $3.50, whether you're going to want to build 8 or 12. But it's not a public policy concern because no matter how it plays out, the market will still provide cheap gas to the relatively inexpensive gas to the United States if the resources are that abundant. More exports imply greater economic benefits. Still had exactly the same finding. The more we export, the greater the increase in GDP. No support for the notion that there's a bigger multiplier on producing chemicals or manufactured goods by keeping natural gas cheap than you get by exporting the natural gas itself. No support in economics for that at all. Now, digression. Jim, forgive me for this, but I've been working on energy policy for 40 years, and I have seen many claims about the benefits that energy or environmental policy will produce for jobs. And I must say that you should disbelieve any claim that you see about the number of jobs that will be produced by either energy or environmental policy, except this one that I'm going to make today. And the reason is that levels of employment in the US economy are driven by macroeconomic policy, by what the Federal Reserve Board does, by conditions in the labor market, and by government policies that affect either the supply or demand for labor. So the Congressional Budget Office has concluded that Obamacare will produce a large decrease in employment by changing essentially the opportunity cost of not working. That raising the minimum wage will produce a substantial reduction in employment. Those things are true, but the only thing energy and environmental policy does is rearrange where the jobs are going to be, except during a recession. And CBO also projects that we are not going to get back to full employment levels of employment until about 2018. So we thought it was worth taking a look at what, on a net basis, increased levels of LNG exports and the investment associated with those exports would produce in terms of job creation, actually of drawing people out of the ranks of the unemployed between now and 2018. And we found that there is an effect, that depending on how fast we're building export facilities, on-site employment might be somewhere between 2,000 jobs to 30,000 jobs at the peak, concentrated in the Gulf Coast. That in terms of reduction in unemployment, we could get anywhere from just a couple thousand to up to 45,000 people off the unemployment rolls because of high levels of LNG, because of the investment that's going to be taking place to build the facilities and drill the wells to increase gas exports. And finally, I think I can do this one quickly because of Tom's excellent presentation. LNG exports cannot possibly destroy the competitive advantage of US manufacturing that we have gained because of low natural gas prices. The maximum difference that LNG exports would make compared to prices with no exports is maybe $1 a million BTU. Now, let's take a look in a little more detail. The blue line here describes relative cost of producing ethylene, the major chemical a principal chemical product of bulk chemicals. Back in 2005, the US is the red dot to the far right on that blue line. It was the world's highest cost producer of ethylene. 2012, what happened? US switched. It's now the world's lowest cost producer of ethylene because our competitors are now paying oil-linked prices for their feedstocks, and we're paying gas-linked prices or less for our feedstocks. So we have gone to a 4-to-1 cost advantage over our competitors in Europe and Asia for producing ethylene. And that's a difference of about 60 cents a pound. The most difference that LNG exports could make in that cost is about 5 cents a pound. So it's just, the debate about just about everything in Washington always seems to be between, if you do what I want, you will save the world, and if you do what my opponents want, the world will come to an end. Well, that's just not the case about LNG exports. Both importers and domestic users can have what they need. And it's really just, the issue about industrial policy really is just a question of where the economy is going to grow most dynamically. And what we found is the rates of growth are indistinguishable for energy-intensive sectors or for chemicals, whether or not we are exporting LNG. But the interesting part is that the exports of natural gas are likely to produce an excess supply of ethane, which will actually make the ethylene industry better off. So let me actually end with that. I will leave these 3 observations about the economic common sense of trade up there and try to squeeze in a few questions and answers. Jim, if we could do that.
Thank you. Questions, cards, send them down, and we will deal with them. And thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
So as we're waiting for the cards to come up, I guess I have a question or two. We really have had a renaissance in manufacturing, partly driven by that. Can you give people a sense of how big of that renaissance has been already?
U.S. manufacturing has not done well for the last decade or so. The growth in manufacturing output has been pretty much stagnant and hasn't caught up with GDP. In the last couple of years, we've seen a big uptick in manufacturing, growing substantially faster than the rest of the economy in the recovery, except for oil and gas production, which has actually grown faster and added more jobs to the economy than all of manufacturing put together. But we have had substantial growth. And we are also looking at substantial investment in the U.S. in manufacturing facilities. The chemical industry, looking at hundreds of billions of dollars of investment in building basically ethylene facilities in the United States so as to use our cheap ethane here in the United States rather than having to depend on basically fractionated naphtha as a feedstock in Europe, which costs 4 or 5 times as much. Similar levels of investment in steelmaking capacity are being talked about too.
Great. Well, let's go back to your basic theme. It seems like the economics of many of these plants really depend upon whether you believe that the natural gas market is going to start globalizing and equilibrating across regions. How likely do you think that's going to happen, and is there a possibility of U.S. becoming sort of a OPEC for natural gas exports?
Yes, it is a major uncertainty for the exporters. It's not going to, I don't think that change is going to happen quickly. For one thing, the Asian buyers are kind of slowly coming off long-term contracts for LNG supplies from the Middle East and from from Australia and Indonesia. They are reopening those contracts using the threat of U.S. exports. And that's going to start moving us toward more gas-on-gas competition. But it's very clear that the Japanese in particular like oil-linked contracts because they don't want to come completely exposed to natural gas price risks. That could slow the process. I think there is probably a window of opportunity. The profits are going to be a lot bigger exporting natural gas from the US for the next 5 to 10 years than they may be 20 or 30 years from now, because I am sure the market is going to move to gas-on-gas competition at some point. High levels of exports from the US could still be very economic, profitable at that point, but it's going to be a different world than it is now. And if that gas-on-gas competition does happen, it's going to be very good for the rest of the world, because it means Europe will be getting cheap gas from Russia, Asia will be getting cheap gas from Oceania, and the US will be participating, but maybe they're more in the order of 4 to 5 TCF of exports rather than the very high levels that could occur otherwise.
We're about out of time, so I want to ask you a question to ask for a quick answer.
Yep.
In your analysis, have you considered the other way you can use natural gas is gas to liquid and therefore arbitrage over the big oil natural gas difference there as another way it can be used domestically?
We have considered it in the sense that we have not found gas to liquids technologies that struck us as being competitive with the other potential uses of natural gas or with continuing use of standard refined products given the increases in US oil production. So it's certainly a prospect that's worth looking at, but at this point, we don't see technologies that are likely to make it a profitable competitor on a large scale.
Right. Well, thank you. At that point, all good things must come to an end. And I have a bunch more questions and zero time on the monitor. So thank you, Dave.